Welcome to Data Skeptic All About Surveys, our season about survey design, interpretation, and methodology. Let your voice be heard at survey.dataskeptic.com. Before we get into today's interview, let's go over the results of the survey I asked you listeners to take last time. This was the Languages Survey, spoken, written, and programming. First question, what do you consider your primary spoken/written language? No surprise at all for an English language podcast, but almost everybody said English. In fact, it's one-offs who didn't. Hebrew, Spanish, Portuguese, Greek, Dutch, German, and Polish each appear exactly once. Hello to my English as a second language listeners. Question 2, what do you consider your primary programming language? And another obvious answer here, Python number 1 answer, R number 2 answer. No clear third or fourth place after that, but a random mix of stuff. I asked participants to give me a list of additional languages they speak, so they're non-primary languages. No clear winners here. A lot of English-only people like myself. But shout out to the listener who has the record here, speaking English, Portuguese, Russian, French, Italian, and only some German. You win the prize as most multilingual respondent. When I ask which of the following programming languages are you at least somewhat proficient in, rather predictably, Python most popular, R number 2, JavaScript number 3, no clear fourth place after that. And lastly, I asked, how do you think AI tools will impact language? And then in parentheses, the broadly inviting statement, either spoken and written or programming, in the years to come. I read every single comment. Thank you all for sharing your thoughts. There wasn't per se a diamond or two I wanted to share, except to say that I think listeners, and maybe this is my desire to be mirrored, but I think we all share a fairly similar sentiment here, that large language models are definitely going to evolve and radically change the nature of what it is to be a programmer. But almost none of you thought that programming was going to go immediately away, although there were a lot of positive thoughts about the possibility of now programming in natural language, which I agree is coming more close to fruition. In any event, that's what you listeners thought. Some of you are members of the NLP Community, Natural Language Processing. I don't know if there's an exact intersection here of my listeners to people who participated in it, but today's interview is going to talk about a survey of that community and their thoughts about topical areas in NLP. Let's get right into it.
Hi, my name's Julian Michael, and I'm a postdoc at the New York University Center for Data Science. I work with a group called the Alignment Research Group. We work in an area called AI alignment, which is mainly concerned with figuring out how we can supervise highly capable AI systems to behave in a way that's desirable to us or is good for society. This involves a lot of trying to make sure these systems are transparent, trying to figure out if we are supervising them with the right objectives, trying to figure out what those right objectives are, and evaluating and understanding their capabilities.
And where is the field of AI safety at maturity-wise? It didn't start yesterday, but it seems like it's an emerging field. How would you characterize it?
One term that I've heard used frequently to describe it is pre-paradigmatic. I think the one unifying thing about people working in AI alignment or AI safety is that we're trying to better understand how these systems work and how to make them work in desirable ways. But we're still working through the conceptual frameworks for figuring out how to operationalize that formally or even informally, know what that means. So it's a little bit of the Wild West, and that makes it an exciting field because there are probably a lot of contributions that we could make if we really put our heads together.
If you had asked me personally 10 years ago what I thought AI safety would mean in the present 10 years later, I think at that time I would have assumed it had to do with robotics. I don't think I would have thought it had much to do with NLP. What's your perspective on it?
You've used the term AI safety a few times, and I've used the term AI alignment, and there are even more terms, right? Like there's also AI ethics, and there's responsible AI. There are a lot of these terms that I think to people who are outside of the field, it's not clear what the distinctions should mean. I don't know if I'm the best person to lay out the entire landscape here, but I think AI alignment and AI safety, at least right now, refer to mostly the same thing, but they emphasize different aspects of the problem. AI safety in today's context is about trying to prevent catastrophic outcomes for humanity, or actually more generally negative outcomes for humanity on the that result from AI decisions. This could include kind of short-term concerns. It could include robotics, like trying to make sure that a robotic system behaves safely. But it also could include NLP systems, which are making classification decisions that drive actions that we take in the real world.
Yeah.
In the kind of short-term case, you can imagine decisions which decide things like employment, like whether you hire someone, or recidivism prediction, which can affect someone's sentencing. But in the longer term, you can imagine if AI decisions are used in decision support for large companies, or if large companies delegate some of their business decisions to AIs, then the decisions that those AI systems make could have really big ramifications for society. And so making sure that those ramifications are good and not bad could also be considered a problem of safety. So I guess you can think of it as with robotics, if we're delegating kind of physical movement and physical operations to robotics, we want to make sure that those robots don't hurt people in the movements that they make. Similarly, if we're delegating knowledge work or kind of cognitive work to systems, we want to make sure that the decisions that they make don't hurt people or harm society.
And as I'd already characterized these, or I forget the term you used. I said emerging field, and yours was what again?
Pre-paradigmatic. We haven't figured out the paradigms yet in which we should even evaluate or make progress. And one of the reasons for that, I think that the word safety maybe makes that a little less clear because it applies to the kind of like easier portions of the problem where you want to maybe avoid obvious harms. But the way to get there, especially when we're talking about those as the result of delegating cognitive or knowledge work to AI systems, it means understanding the implications of the decision that a model makes, right? Which might involve many intermediate nodes before the actual outcome that you care about. And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that if the AI is really effective at optimizing towards some objective, that that objective is well aligned with the objective that you want to achieve in society or for yourself. And so that's why this field is sometimes called AI alignment, because to the extent that an AI system is going to take care to optimize an objective effectively, you need that objective to be aligned with what you actually want.
So, in that context, my impression of AI alignment, or at least my instinct of where to focus some effort, as I'm sure many people are doing, I've seen a lot of papers on this, but let's go examine the objective function. Maybe we need to regularize it or fine tune it, but we can treat alignment as a tensor operation, that it's just a mathematical problem to solve. But as you say, it's pre paradigmatic. Where else might we look?
Yeah, that's a big question. Examining the objective function isn't necessarily enough for a lot of reasons. One is even if you know something about the objective function that the system is trained against, you don't necessarily know what all the consequences would be for optimizing that objective effectively. And you don't know if that's the objective that you actually want. There's also the problem that even if you train a model to optimize an objective, that doesn't mean that the model has actually learned to act as an optimizer of that objective. And honestly, this is getting a little bit into the weeds of AI alignment concepts, which are actually quite contested.
True.
And I think, as I said, there's a lot of work to be done here. But to try to answer your question briefly, the places that we can look are, first of all, the objectives that we are training the machines with. Second, we can look inside of the systems and see what features they're picking up on and if there are internal representations of objectives. We can think about ways of supervising and structuring systems that give them more transparent internal structure than a black box optimizer. So, decomposition methods where you force a system to solve a problem in two stages, and those two stages are optimized separately so that you know something about how the system works instead of simply training it to optimize an objective as a black box. So, those are a few different approaches to trying to understand better how these systems work. You can think of understanding black box systems better, or you can think of building systems that are more inherently transparent and understandable.
No, I like that. It's a good classification system. And I appreciate you coming up with it on the spot when I actually brought you on to talk about a totally different topic. But Can't help
Sure.
myself when I'm talking to alignment people these days. It's such an interesting topic.
I can imagine. Yeah.
But maybe let's get into our main segments. The paper I initially contacted you about is titled "What Do NLP Researchers Believe? Results of the NLP Community Metasurvey." So very much at the intersection of a lot of things we talk about on Data Skeptic. I guess to kick things off, can you tell me a little bit about how the project got started?
I actually started this project when I was still a PhD student at the University of Washington. I have collaborated with the group here at NYU in the past, and I was discussing some collaboration ideas with them a little more than a year ago. I think it was February, probably 2022. This idea had come up of doing a survey and meta survey of the NLP community, and I'll get to what that means in a bit. But it was actually directly inspired by the Phil Papers surveys, which I think you've also covered on the podcast.
We have indeed, yeah.
I just thought this idea was super interesting because one thing that I care a lot about and I think a lot about is how we communicate with each other. I think there are a lot of communication failures that happen. And I think that we could do a lot better, but it's a really hard problem to figure out how to improve the situation. This survey seemed like at least some way of making progress and understanding the issue a little bit better. And I don't know enough about the philosophy community to know if the motivation for the Phil Papers survey was similar. But in our case, at least my desire to do this survey was in part due to how many controversial issues we have in the NLP community that are discussed hotly on social media in such a way that it's really hard to tell what the majority opinion is and how to communicate effectively. Because on a lot of issues around the ethics of how to build and deploy models, or the interpretation of what these models are doing and how we should talk about them. So, for example, if we're talking about whether language models understand language, or whether researchers bear responsibility for dual use, where they build an artifact that gets kind of misused by someone downstream. So, there's a lot of discussion of these issues where people have very strong opinions, and sometimes they treat their own view as obvious, but the people who have the opposite view also treat their view as obvious. And as a result, I think communication sometimes breaks down because communication relies on shared assumptions. Like if you want to make an argument that persuades someone, your argument will inevitably have to appeal to some axioms. But if you appeal to axioms that aren't shared by your audience, then you aren't going to make any progress with them. At the same time, if you don't know what assumptions your audience has, you might waste your time making an argument that everyone already agrees with. And I think all of these are bad things. The worst case to me seems to be if everyone kind of views their own opinion as kind of fair game for taking for granted, because I think that this can result in fracturing of the discourse, where what used to be a single cohesive community where people could challenge each other's views and make constructive progress becomes a set of distinct echo chambers which become increasingly incapable of talking to each other. And that's the kind of situation that I want to avoid. But I feel like we are pushed further in that direction as a bunch of controversial issues have come up in AI. I think the reason that this is happening now, well, okay, it's probably very complex, but I can imagine a couple of reasons for it. One being that AI progress has been so fast and so many things have been changing that it's really hard to predict the future. There's a lot of uncertainty about how these systems work and where they're going. And where there's uncertainty, there's going to be disagreement. And so we have maybe more disagreement than we used to have in the community. And also, this disagreement has higher stakes because the systems are being
Yeah.
deployed in more and more contexts. And so, because the disagreement is higher stakes, maybe existing disagreements that were kind of latent because they weren't so relevant to the research that was being done are now suddenly relevant. And so I think the discourse has become a lot more contentious. And so it's especially important that we understand it better so that we can improve it and make progress. So this was a big part of my motivation for doing this survey and why I thought maybe doing the survey could help at least contribute to improving the discourse by creating some sense of common ground. Because even if we don't agree on on the object level issues, we can at least agree on the sociological question of what the NLP community believes. The question of, well, how obvious are these issues, at least to the community? And so that gives us a starting point for more productive discourse.
Today's podcast is supported by the University of San Francisco. At USF's Masters in Applied Economics, you can learn the skills you need to succeed in the digital economy, whether you're looking for your first job or aiming to level up in your career. You'll be studying at ground zero of the new economy, surrounded by the firms that built it and the startups that will create the next revolution. This STEM-designated master's program combines economics training with the practical skills and data analytics needed to work in the new digital economy. Students study the economics of platforms, auctions, pricing, reputation, and business strategy at the same time as they learn key tools like econometrics, causal inference, experimental design, data visualization, natural language processing, and machine learning. Students new to serious data work will have an on-ramp of courses to help them get up to speed, while those with previous background can jump directly at advanced topics. Learn more and get an application fee waiver by going to usfca.edu/skeptic. Check out the University of San Francisco at usfca.edu/skeptic. This episode of Data Skeptic is made possible in part by Mimecast. You're wondering if you need more email and collaboration security. After all, you've already got M365 protecting your workplace. That's good enough. What more could you need? Well, a lot really. What if one of your employees just opened a phishing email and M365 couldn't handle it alone? Now your company has to ground to a screeching halt. Transformers stop transforming. Circuits short circuit, all because of a single email. Like they say, just one match can burn this town. Next time, take 5 minutes to set up Mimecast, a security solution specifically designed for email and workplace collaboration. It detects suspicious emails and diversifies your security stack so you're not just relying on one generic solution. Your inbox is important, so get another layer of protection for it and keep your business from, falling apart. For a free trial, go to mimecast.com. That's Mimecast, MIMECAST.com. When you say the NLP community, I have a sense of what that means, but you have to have some recruiting process or maybe a formalism for how you let people into the panel. Can you tell me a little bit about how you recruit?
Yes, that's right. Especially for a survey like this, we need to have a clearly defined target demographic. And of course, there are lots of people who qualify as NLP researchers. NLP research gets published in machine learning venues, it gets published in AI venues, and it gets published in venues hosted by the Association for Computational Linguistics, which is the main professional organization for NLP researchers, at least that's specific to NLP. So we chose to define the survey population in terms of the ACL, which is the Association for Computational Linguistics. What we're interested in is understanding the scholarly discourse. And so that means finding people who are active in the ACL community. So we defined our target demographic as people who have published, or at least co-authored, at least 2 papers in ACL venues in the last 3 years. And so in case any of your listeners are familiar with ACL conferences, this includes the ACL conference, it includes the EMNLP conference, it includes NACL and EACL. There are maybe like 3-ish large conferences put on each year as part of the kind of main conference program of the ACL. So it's a reasonably large community, and our target demographic was somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 people.
And what did it end up turning out to be?
You mean how many people responded to the survey?
Yeah, we know it's never 100%. That's one of the things I've learned in the season on surveys. But you've got a very targeted group. How big of a response did you get?
We got 480 responses, 327 of which were in our target demographic. It came out to something like 5%-ish of the total, which is not huge, but it was enough to give us enough statistical power to say interesting things about the results.
Absolutely, yeah. And a hard group to sample, I would imagine, at the same time, really.
I don't know if we already want to talk about what we would do differently if we did it again, but this is actually one thing that I definitely would have done differently, or I would do differently if I repeated the survey, is how we do recruitment. So one of the challenges is we can identify everyone in our target demographic automatically by computing statistics on the ACL anthology, which is the collection of all published materials at ACL venues. But we don't have the ability to automatically extract emails for all of the authors. So if we wanted to send out individual emails, we would need to scrape their emails manually.
Mm-hmm.
And that just seems like a large time investment. So
Yeah.
instead, we use mailing lists and social media as the primary way of advertising the survey, and word of mouth. We sent out notices on several prominent mailing lists, including the ACL official mailing list. We tweeted and retweeted a bunch. One of my co-authors posted about it on WeChat to get some Chinese authors, although we actually didn't get much of a response from ACL authors based in China. We also advertised physically at the ACL conference. We had some flyers and stickers and that sort of thing. So we tried to make as many overtures as we could besides sending out individual emails. But about halfway through the survey period, so the survey ran from May partway through June in 2022. And I think sometime around mid to late May, we were looking at the survey demographics and we found that some groups were deeply underrepresented, like particularly ACL authors based in China were really, really underrepresented. And so we were thinking about ways to improve this situation without necessarily biasing the results in an undesirable way too much. And we ended up actually going through the list of the most highly published authors in ACL. We kind of split up the work through several of the co-authors and manually scraped a whole bunch of emails and then sent out emails asking for them to fill out the survey. It didn't help too much with the underrepresentation issue, but it did help us get some more responses. So one thing that I would do differently were I to do it again is I would just bite the bullet and at the very beginning get several people together and manually scrape a whole bunch of email, or maybe we can automate it somehow, but collect a whole bunch of emails and send individualized emails so that at the very least we could say that we tried, because I think that would also potentially help reduce some of the response bias or sampling bias that we ended up with in the survey at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think that's a good project, not an easy one, but a fun one for maybe some undergrads or grad students to take on.
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe GPT-4 could do it
Hey, there's a neat
with a
idea.
little plugin.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I find that slightly frightening, and it feels like a little bit of an invasion of privacy to automate that kind of task, but so be it.
And for a listener who'd like to imagine taking the survey, could you maybe give an example of one question and the format of how it's broken down? Like, is it a Likert scale or what are the questions like?
The format that the vast majority of the questions took was stating some kind of opinion or a stance that a person could take, and then asking the respondent whether they agree or disagree with it. For example, the first question on the survey was the statement, "Private firms have too much influence in guiding the trajectory of the field." And then the respondent could answer on a 4-point Likert scale from disagree to weakly disagree to weakly agree to agree. But they could also provide one of three other answers. They could say insufficiently informed on the issue if basically they didn't know enough about the issue in the statement in order to have an opinion on it. They could say question is ill posed if they just didn't want to agree or disagree with it. Or they could answer prefer not to say for a kind of nondescript way of refusing to answer the question. In practice, less than 20% of people chose one of those other options, I think, on the vast majority of questions. On any survey like this, you need to provide some kind of escape hatch so people who don't have an opinion on the issue or who simply disagree with the phrasing
Yeah.
aren't forced into agreeing or disagreeing. But in practice, we found that this wasn't a huge issue on the survey. The main goal for us was to get people to agree or disagree, to basically say which side of the fence they're on these issues. Because, especially on controversial issues, you can imagine a lot of people simply wouldn't want to express an opinion. So, this is why we didn't have a midpoint on the Likert scale. I think
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that we read about when kind of researching how to design the survey is that a midpoint can kind of serve as a dumping ground for people who don't want to take a stance on the question. And so that's why our other options were kind of specific, right? We say
Yeah.
insufficiently informed on the issue, right? So you only should answer that if you actually don't know what the statement is talking about.
Right, right.
Or a question is ill posed, you would only answer that if you think the statement is actually just entirely ill posed and like doesn't have it or can't have a truth value. And it seems to have worked reasonably well. We also told people with weakly agree or weakly disagree, the two middle points in the scale, that they should choose it even if they're only leaning slightly to one side. So we said, if your view is depends, but leaning negative, then just say weakly disagree. That's what that is for. And the reason that we really wanted people to take a stance was because of the meta survey aspect of this, right? So we called it the NLP Community Metasurvey because we not only solicited opinions from people on these statements, we also had them predict what was the rate of agreement with each statement. And so
Yeah.
if you take all of the people who express some view, whether they agree or disagree on the statement, what percentage of people do you think agree? And we asked them this for every single opinion question on the survey, where they could answer in 5 buckets from 0 to 20%, 20 to 40%, 40 to 60%, 60 to 80%, or 80 to 100%. And that way we could basically test if people think that their view is obvious and shared by the vast majority of the community, is that actually true?
And yet, to your point earlier, that sometimes maybe because someone has a big social media presence, they can be a squeaky wheel, and it can seem to make the conversation leaned in one direction. But then you would hope that researchers would know about that. Using that data, are you able to make a statement about the degree to which we understand NLP researchers know about their peers' points of view?
I can tell you that it varied depending on the question, but there were some strong divergences
Hmm.
between what people predicted and the views that people actually held. It might be worth going over some of the sources of demographic bias first. I'll briefly run through what I think are the most important factors. And you can look at the paper to get details on these issues, and we discuss it in detail. But the main things to account for are our respondent population was overwhelmingly academic. It skewed senior, so we actually had more faculty than PhD students answer the survey, if I remember correctly. And it skewed towards people who use Twitter.
Sure.
And it skewed American, so people from the United States, whereas China and India and Japan were all kind of deeply underrepresented. I think the Twitter thing is important because, yeah, we're getting the views of a small subset of the community that probably is kind of more aware of controversies and maybe thinking more about controversies. But the other thing is the industry versus academia issue, I think is important for interpreting the meta survey results. When answering the meta questions, when trying to predict how the rest of the respondents will answer on the survey, you're predicting that on the basis of assumptions about the demographics of that community.
Hmm.
If you think of most NLP researchers as coming from industry, or if you think of industry views as dominant in the field, then maybe you'll predict in a way that aligns more with industry views. But because of the response bias in the survey, where we got more academic responses, it's going to make your predictions look more wrong, at least in those places where academics and industry researchers disagree. And I think this is particularly relevant for the questions about scale and linguistics and the relevance of cognitive science and this kind of thing, because I think the results that we got in the survey skewed more towards what academics tend to believe in comparison to industry. And this was the same direction as the object level results differed from the predicted results. And so some of the false sociological beliefs that we measured might have actually been false sociological beliefs about the demographics of the survey. Unfortunately, we didn't have meta questions on the demographic section. I don't know if that's something we could reasonably expect someone to predict, but it's just something to keep in mind when interpreting the results. So, yeah.
Yeah, a subtle but very good point. Well, you've got a great opportunity then to ask a very specific audience of people some questions. How do you decide what to ask?
Yeah. So, the way that we chose these questions originally was the research team basically got together and brainstormed a whole bunch of stuff in a Google Doc, and we shopped each other's questions for a while. and then we voted on them and kept the ones that most people agreed would be interesting to have in the survey. We wanted to ask about issues which are frequently discussed in the community and which are the subject of public disagreement, and also about which our community reflects back on itself, right? Where people seem to have views about how obvious or how popular the opinion is, and where our hope is if we understand those opinions better, it would aid our ability to communicate with each other. What that meant is we're actively seeking out issues that we think are controversial and that are the subject of fights, which, like some people said when I was first piloting the survey, that it was kind of brave to do this survey. I don't necessarily think that's the case. Like, I think it's actually hard to object to someone who's just doing a survey like this. The challenge is just wording the questions in a way that doesn't make people upset because of the presuppositions that they feel are included in the questions. And this comes into play on some of our questions about artificial general intelligence, language models understanding language, or catastrophic risk, where we're kind of pointing to issues that some people think aren't well defined, or even kind of raising the issue in a particular framing could be harmful. After we kind of shopped down all the questions, we ended up categorizing them into some overall themes. So we had 6 questions on the state of NLP as a field. So these are about things like whether academia or industry has too much influence, or whether they're going to produce the most widely cited work, and whether NLP is actually doing good science, or whether most of the research in our field is kind of dubious scientific value. So these are the kinds of questions in the first section. In the second section, we had 4 questions on the subject of scale and inductive bias. So if you're familiar with the term scaling hypothesis, which is sometimes thrown around, this idea that scaling up deep learning models and training them on more and more data will eventually kind of solve all of the practical problems that we want to solve. So we had a question about that. And then we had questions about whether things like expert derived, or rather, expert designed inductive biases, like, for example, symbolic operations, are necessary to solve all practical problems at some point in the far future, and whether linguistics or cognitive science will contribute importantly to the field. We had then a section on artificial general intelligence and catastrophic risks. Not just catastrophic risk, actually. So we asked whether artificial general intelligence is something that NLP researchers should be concerned with, and whether it's something we're making progress towards. We also asked whether AI and labor automation caused by AI would bring changes on the scale of another industrial revolution. And we also asked if it was plausible that decisions made by AI or ML systems could cause a catastrophe on at least the scale of all-out nuclear war. So these are asking about kind of really, really big scale consequences of AI. We then had a section on language understanding, asking whether language models understand language in various forms. We had a section with 7 questions on promising research programs, whether things like explainability or interpretability is on the wrong track in the NLP community. And then we had a section on ethics. So whether NLP is doing good as a field, whether researchers bear responsibility for misuse of systems that they help develop, whether we should be worried about carbon footprint, and whether NLP should be regulated. These are the kinds of questions that we had in the last section. So if you're familiar with the public discourse in NLP, you probably recognize a lot of these things as issues that people are talking about where you can hear a variety of opinions. And so we were hoping to just characterize what is that kind of landscape among active NLP researchers.
Is there any aspect of this that surprised you when you finally got into the data?
A lot, actually. So one of the cool things about this survey is you can actually quantify how surprising the results are, because you get everyone to predict what the results are going to
Oh,
be.
yeah.
And I can tell you that my predictions were not very good. So we had 5 buckets where you would predict either, maybe 0 to 20% or 40 to 60% of people would agree. And I think my accuracy bucket wise was about 20%, which is random. So I learned a lot from this survey. And I can tell you what the kind of officially most surprising results were. Both of the most surprising results came on this issue of scale and contribution of adjacent fields like cognitive science or linguistics. So, the biggest disparity between what people actually answered and what they predicted the answers would be came on the second section about scale, where we ask about the scaling hypothesis. So, the statement here is that given resources, i.e., compute and data, that could come to exist this century, scaled up implementations of established existing techniques will be sufficient to practically solve any important real world problem or application in NLP. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but we wanted to make sure that it was a kind of like precise statement of what we think roughly captures this idea of scaling maximalism or the scaling hypothesis. If you average the midpoints of all the buckets that people chose, so if someone said, I think 60 to 80% of people will agree, we treat that as a 70% prediction. And then we just average all of those predictions. It averages out to 47% expected agreement, is what people predicted other people would say on this answer. So they thought it would be kind of an evenly split, contentious issue on average. But in reality, only 17% of the respondents agreed with that. And so that tells us that this scaling narrative, which is very popular, I think, and very much discussed in the public discourse, is maybe less held by the respondent population who we got for the survey. Maybe the level of hype that it gets on social media is disproportionate to the level of credence that NLP researchers have in the idea.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good measurement of it, right? If people are presuming that the community would be more in agreement with that than they actually were, that's sort of an indicator of the hype level.
And we found a result that agrees with that from later in the survey when we were asking about interdisciplinary insights. So this statement was, compared to the current state of affairs, NLP researchers should place greater priority on incorporating insights and methods from relevant domain sciences, e.g., sociolinguistics, cognitive science, and human-computer interaction. If we average the predictions that people made about what the community would say, on average, they thought about 53% of people would agree with that statement. In reality, 82% of people agreed. And it was one of the most agreed with statements on the entire survey. And this is kind of like the opposite of the prior question. It's not exactly the same because the prior question was kind of descriptive. It was saying scaling could potentially do this. It was almost kind of like a technical question. This question is prescriptive about, well, what should we be doing when we move research forward? So it's a different question, but they agree with each other that it seems like a lot of researchers think that we're not exploring interdisciplinary insights and incorporating those into NLP research as much as we should, and that scaling is not as promising as the community seems to think that it is. So these do paint a coherent picture. I think this is a good place to talk about the caveats. So, any place where you do have a disagreement between what people actually believe and like what they predict, you have to have, well, you don't have to, but we're interested in an explanation of that disagreement. One potential view is that they see the hyping of scale and they assume that the view of scaling maximalism is more representative of the community than it is. But another way of looking at these results, if we think about incorporating interdisciplinary insights, one thing that I find kind of interesting is this idea that we should do more to incorporate its interdisciplinary insights from nearby sciences. It's not a new one. Before, I think, the deep learning revolution, people were also saying this. People have kind of always said this, that we need to incorporate more stuff from nearby fields. And if everyone is saying this, then why do they think the community still isn't doing it? I think even a lot of the people who say that it would be good maybe aren't focusing their research agenda on it. One potential explanation is that, first of all, this view is easily defensible, right? Like, I think you're probably people, it's kind of hard to disagree with. Oh, yeah, there might be insights there, right? It's almost like a statement of existence. Like, there's some benefit to be had from incorporating stuff from nearby fields. So it's a little bit hard to attack, but I also think it might represent a form of wishful thinking because we don't have alternatives, right? Like, we don't know how to make progress besides scaling, as you mentioned. And before scaling, we just didn't know how to make progress really at all. And so it's very tempting to say, well, let's incorporate stuff from these other sciences, which, I'm not an expert in, right? So it's like, because you don't know maybe those sciences and everything they have to offer, you can always appeal to them as something which might be able to help you out. But the problem is nobody actually knows how to make it work. And we don't have the kind of evaluation paradigms to even measure if such insights would be really helpful. And insofar as we do in things like benchmarking, they haven't really been super helpful in a lot of cases. And usually they're overridden by, better optimization power, more data, that sort of thing.
Well, you'd mentioned benchmarks specifically. I've interviewed a number of people who've worked on a variety of these benchmarks, all the way back from MNIST to more contemporary things like the Big Bench test. There's a lot of effort put into these areas. If going based on that information alone, I would think that the NLP community is very much in favor of them and values them. But what does the survey tell us?
Yeah, so I've also worked on some of these benchmarks, and I've kind of experienced firsthand the challenge of producing benchmarks that last, especially in the current age. One of the experiences that we've had, especially with deep learning, is you build a benchmark and then very quickly it becomes obsolete because systems can either overfit to spurious correlations in your benchmark, or scaling of general purpose models happens so fast that they improve beyond the kind of capability level that your benchmark is capable of measuring. Yet, there are not many alternatives for assessing and measuring progress. And so we continue to have these like big scale, especially multitask benchmarks, because you can maybe extract some kind of signal from those. And I think there's still more juice that we can get out of benchmarks. But if we look at the survey, we had one question. And again, this is a normative question, not a descriptive question,
Mhm.
where the statement is currently the field focuses too much on optimizing performance on benchmarks. So the agreement rate here is a measure of how negative people are on benchmarks. And 88% of respondents agreed to this. So a lot of people in NLP think that we're overemphasizing benchmarks.
Hmm.
And I think this partly comes from this disillusionment of we build benchmarks, and when the machine beats the benchmark, the sign is usually not that the machine has simply solved the task that the benchmark was supposed to represent, but that the benchmark was not sufficient to measure the machine's capability anymore.
Well, I'm curious if you've heard any community response from those who've taken or just reviewed the survey results. What's been the general response?
I think the response was pretty positive for the most part, which I think also highlights the perhaps irrationality of some of the fear that people have of
Hmm.
engaging in public discourse. Now, I guess that's a strong statement that it's irrational. I think it's okay to fear that, and like that you see bad things happen on social media all the time. But when I was putting together this survey and piloting it, I did have multiple people say, "Oh, this is brave," right? Because you're kind of bringing up issues around which there's controversy. But if we're examining them in an impartial way, reporting the results, soliciting opinions from a wide variety of people, and providing appropriate kind of scientific interpretation and caveats and limitations to our results, then I think people are quite receptive to it because it's useful information for all of us. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we had a pretty positive reception. I think it's also fun, like thinking about these kind of it's a survey full of hot takes, right? So I think people enjoy this. The kind of most notable thing about the public reception of this survey was actually on the basis of the answers in the AGI section, which we haven't quite gotten to yet, but maybe it would be a good time to cover that. This
Yeah.
is what basically all of the news outlets reported on. And the
Okay.
vast majority of the news outlets would pair their article with an image either of a nuclear explosion or a very menacing image of a robot. Uh, yeah. In some cases, these images were generated by Dolly.
Well, how appropriate. Well, that's an
Right.
intimidating image. I imagine the headline to follow is equally intimidating.
Yeah, so the headline to follow was something like a third of AI researchers fear Judgment Day from robots, which is, I think, a stretch. I would not have taken that away from our survey, but it's probably worth discussing that actual question.
Yeah.
So this was the question on global catastrophe. The statement was, it is plausible that decisions made by AI or machine learning systems could cause a catastrophe this century that is at least as bad as an all-out nuclear war. 36% of people agreed with this statement. And actually, the community was relatively well calibrated on the statement, predicting on average 37% agreement. So they were kind of on the dot if you average out people's predictions. This view was not necessarily more or less prevalent than expected, although I think it was more prevalent than I expected. You can imagine how a lot of people would read this, and especially journalists or news outlets might catch on to it and be like, this seems big, right? Because that's about a third of respondents, and we're talking about something at least as bad as all-out nuclear war, which I think people think of that as essentially apocalypse.
Yeah.
The challenge here, I think, might be the difference between how a scientist and how a journalist might interpret the statement that something is plausible. That, and also, what does it mean for an AI or ML decision to cause a global catastrophe? So
True.
there are a bunch of different ways that you can interpret this question. First of all, if you say a decision made by an AI or machine learning system could cause a catastrophe, one could imagine a situation where maybe you have like a nuclear early warning system, and perhaps you use AI for it, and perhaps the AI malfunctions and tells you that a nuke is coming your way. And so you start a nuclear exchange as a result of this, right? This is like something that someone could totally think is plausible, but is actually a result of AI incapability, as opposed to, I think, people who are worried about global catastrophic risk in the AI safety field are more worried about very highly capable systems kind of taking over the world. You could also have something where, if you have, for example, an unpredictable world leader who maybe uses AI to justify a decision that they wanted to make, right? Like, if AI decisions are in any way wrapped up in geopolitics, then you could easily causally connect them to some global catastrophe. And so you
Yeah.
can imagine it's very easy to actually answer yes to this question that it's plausible. Basically, I think that some of the people who answered yes were thinking about things like this, and some of the people who answered yes were thinking about things like Skynet. Like, you have a super capable AI system which overpowers humanity and causes some kind of broad disempowerment of humans. And it's very hard to say how much of the people who agreed with the statement thought one view or the other.
Yeah.
The other aspect of this question is the word plausible. I think that in science, we try to be conservative. And if you say something's implausible, that's very close to saying it's impossible, right? The word plausible is closer to possible than likely. And so you can think it's plausible without thinking that it's something that we should actually be concerned about. If you want to say, well, I don't want to rule it out. And I think as scientists, our instinct is to kind of minimize embarrassment. We're kind of like embarrassment minimizers when it comes to our epistemics. Like, we don't want to confidently say things that are wrong. With weak statements like plausibility, you're going to have people probably agree by default. As opposed to, if you're reading this from the perspective of a journalist, it's very easy to say like, oh, well, they're worried. Whereas thinking it's plausible is very different from being worried about it.
Well, I'm glad to see the survey ran, and it's such an exciting time to be in NLP. I would love to see it run on a regular basis. Do the resources exist to repeat this?
So fortunately, I think it would be easier to run this again than it was the first time. The challenge is the set of questions which is relevant will probably be different.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if it's worth doing every year. I currently don't have plans to necessarily do it again, but it does sound like something that would be fun and interesting, so that we could get a little bit of longitudinal data, especially to see how people's opinions are changing as AI progress happens so rapidly.
Exactly, yeah. Well, Julian, where can listeners learn more about you?
I guess they can go to julianmichael.org, which is my homepage, or my Twitter, which is Julian Michael with underscores on either side, like you're italicizing it in Markdown. You can read my papers, I
Oh,
guess.
sure. We'll have links to all of the above in the show notes so listeners can follow up. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, it was a pleasure.
Well, that concludes this installment of Data Skeptic All About Surveys. Find out more about the show at dataskeptic.com.